2015 Development Agenda. And we are very pleased to have a joint effort between the Public-Private Alliance Foundation, which I head, and the United Nations Association of the USA, the New York State Southern Division, as collaborators in this. My wife Ginger is seated in the room, is the president of the UNA division. And you will find by the door pamphlets about the United Nations Association. And if you are not already members of the UNA USA, I certainly encourage you to join. It is one of the stalwarts of the United Nations, a non-profit organization that promotes the awareness of the principles and activities of the United Nations to the American public, and the encouragement for the United States to take a strong leadership role in the United Nations. So it's a very important linkage point. Here comes some more guests to our session. Very significant element on energy and climate. I want to give a very quick introduction to them, and so that you will know a bit about them before they speak. First on our list is Tapio Kaninen, who has had a career in the United Nations, as did I. And he is currently Senior Fellow and Co-Director of the Project on Sustainable Global Governance of the Ralph Bunche Institute for International Studies at the Graduate Center in the City University of New York. And during his career in the UN, he was Chief of Policy Planning Unit in the UN Department of Political Affairs, head of the Secretariat of Kofi Annan's 5 summits with regional organizations, and earlier work before the UN with the government of Finland. George Garland, here to my right, is a former official of the United States Environmental Protection Agency, and he's currently head of the Energy Project of the United Nations Association Southern New York State Division, and he is a Public-Private Alliance Foundation board member. Amy Parekh-Mehta it will be dealing with climate change and energy issues as seen from the Sustainable Development Goals. And she is a Program Management Officer at the International Union for Conservation of Nature, which is a permanent observer mission to the United Nations. And she also teaches environmental law at Pace University Law School. Then to my far right we have Vadim Belikov, who is going to speak on involving social entrepreneurs for solutions in energy and climate action. He is the co-founder and co-chair of the Next Generation Energy Leaders Council, Vice Chairman of the G8 Young Summit, Vice President of the Board of the Business Assembly of the G20Y Summit, which is an intergovernmental organization, an NGO, Vice President of the International Youth Diplomacy League, and the CEO, and in his day job, is CEO of PSD. It's a development company in real estate in St. Petersburg, Russia. Also, he's involved in consultation with international business companies and advises a number of international clients on business development in Russia, and he's the owner of a consulting company in that respect. So we have a wide range of perspectives from the UN, from the US, from the nonprofit NGO, and from the business community. I think this is an excellent combination, and I want to give the floor now to Tapio Kaninen to speak and make a video presentation, a PowerPoint presentation on the subject, Crisis of Global Sustainability.
Thank you, David. It's nice to be back at the UN. I'm talking today about the crisis of global sustainability and energy's role in that crisis. And why are we in a global crisis? Really in a global emergency, in my view. And the reason is this, that we have not done and last 30 years, almost nothing, basically nothing to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And the global fossil emissions basically continue to follow the worst case path and heading to 4 to 6 Celsius increase in temperature compared to pre-industrial times, and not the international standard of 2 Celsius. And the graph really
move the microphone a bit
closer. The graph really shows that we are in the worst part, which is the upper one, and this is emissions according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the highest basic graph in the picture. And the UN has negotiated climate change issues for some 25 years, as we know, and basically no results in this most critical issue, which is the CO2, carbon dioxide emissions. And so what is behind these greenhouse gas emissions? If you look at this World Energy Outlook 2011, and we see the bottom 3 trends, gas, coal and oil. That is the 80–90% of, and that is the most polluting part of it. And at the bottom, Patrick Bureau, chief economist of the International Energy Agency, is saying that the world is currently following a trajectory which will increase temperature by 6 Celsius relative to today, or which the energy sector is largely responsible. If that is allowed to happen, we are all in big trouble. Now let's go to look briefly at the critical issue of interconnections between climate change and global energy use. How could we attain this critical issue? 2 Celsius official target in climate change talks and continue our current economic growth and energy use as before. And I'm using here my old friend Ian Dunlop's thesis. And Dunlop was Royal Shell's engineer and senior executive over 30 years, and he has been also a main developer of the carbon emission trading system in Australia. And his first question is that can we continue economic growth with this kind of energy use while simultaneously limiting global temperature increase, and I change to this one, the global temperature increase to 2 Celsius. That's a basic question, and his answer is clearly no. We are not running out of either coal, oil, gas resources. The issue is how to convert these resources into flows to the market in an environmentally, that's polluting, and economically acceptable manner, or to move to alternative energy sources. And the big problem here is that only 30–40%, and I guess now it's even over 20% of current proven fossil fuel reserves can be burned to have a reasonable chance of remaining below 2 Celsius target. And this is the issue of stranded assets of oil companies and of carbon bubble. I guess there was in New York Times 2 days ago something about that, and we cannot have time to go to that, but that's a big issue. The second question is, can technology help us move quickly to make the use of fossil fuels less polluting so that our economic growth with energy use as we have now can continue? And the answer is also clear no. At present, technologies to make such a transition would be too expensive, too environmentally damaging and time consuming. The third question is, can our global economic growth with current energy use model continue to quickly move to the alternative sources of renewables and nuclear? And here also the answer is no, because primarily solar, wind and nuclear, that's the present alternatives, contribute only a small portion of global energy supplies relative to fossil. And this graph shows it. Almost 90% of global energy consumption comes from fossil fuels, and this on the top here you see how small the numbers are for renewables. So high-level panel of eminent persons on the post-2050 development agency realized these issues. In 2013 it says, that's the top, that above all there is one trend, climate change, which will determine whether or not we can deliver on our ambitions. And then later it says there is not evidence yet that the upward trend in CO2 emissions has been slowed or reversed, as it must be if potentially catastrophic changes in climate are to be avoided. And at the end we will be on the path to at least 4 Celsius degree warming of a pre-industrial level by this century's end. According to the World Bank, such a 4 Celsius scenario would be devastating. But then, high-level panel itself just hoped that the international community could reduce CO2 and other greenhouse emissions and keep the temperature increase below 2 Celsius degree, but there is not really evidence so far that this will be the case. Both the national fossil fuel industry interests are dominating the negotiation environment. And the key issue here is that the global change required to move quickly from fossil fuel-based industry to a renewables-based global economy is unprecedented, but really necessary in order to avoid a catastrophic runaway climate change. And my thesis is that we have to take a longer-term view in the sustainable development goals and post-development agenda, and see where the world is going with present trends and move backwards to set up our targets from that longer-term perspective. But this is not going to be easy. UN system task team on the post-2015 UN development agenda also last year, July 2013, saw this also and said that long-term trajectories, say to 2050 and beyond, may be much more critical, even catastrophic, than the trend of 5-10 years would suggest. And unfortunately right now we are focusing only the 5-10 years and not the 50 years from now what our children and grandchildren are facing. And so we might face this phase, long-term trajectories, say 2050 and beyond, may be much more critical, even catastrophic, should be our starting point for any serious work in this area. Now, what would this all mean in practice? High-level panel proposed a number of social SDGs proposed in its outcome document, which came out last month, that this goal should be watered down a bit. It's not doubling, but now increasing substantially. But much more worrisome was the second one, because panel had proposed the following: phase out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies that encourage wasteful consumption. And this should have been sharpened and be more ambitious, but the open working group of General Assembly took it out. The whole thing moved it elsewhere and watered it down with all kind of caveats, which makes it more or less meaningless. And this is not a promising sign for next year's negotiations on climate change. The issue is really that the governments give fossil fuel subsidies annually of $500 billion US dollars, and renewable investments, the subsidies are just about $88 billion. So the money flow into fossil energy is about 3 to 4 times bigger than into renewables. And this is our biggest problem on the planet right now, how to change this flow of subsidies. And it has to be a massive transfer of renewables from fossils, and very quickly. It's really an emergency issue for humankind's future, a couple of years. And we don't have time, I guess, to go to the solutions, but one piece which I mentioned here is the global cap and trade system, or realistic price for carbon, and hopefully in next year's negotiations in Paris. Thank you.
Over the next period of years, and indeed we need to look not at 5 or 10 years, but at 50, 100, 200 years to look at the prospects. Our next speaker is George Garland, who will be talking about climate policy in the U.S. and the UN.
Thank you, David. This week, the Obama administration announced work on a politically binding international climate change agreement for nations to cut greenhouse gas emissions without ratification from the U.S. Congress. If you were in the earlier presentation in the Trusteeship Council, you saw that rules are going to be where it's at. Well, it appears that politically binding agreements may be something that we'll be looking at in addition to rules. At the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, Paris meeting in 2015, some of the world's largest economies would commit to enact laws to reduce their carbon pollution. So in that earlier presentation, the French gentleman talked about perceptions. And shame and blame is going to be a perception that nations encounter if they don't play the game that comes out of Paris, for all working together to do something about climate change, a little different from rules. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released a report just this week, and the previous speaker's projections are right on. The way I read it, it's going to be 4.7 degrees by the year 2100 instead of 2%, so it's more than twice the goal that we're striving for, is what they're saying. And they call for many measures to reduce energy intensity and improve carbon sinks, which must be implemented in a coordinated effort by many nations. In other words, it can't be just one nation doing something. It has to be everybody working together. Projections by the U.S. Energy Information Agency's Annual Energy Outlook, with projections for 2040, show a 25% increase in demand for electric power in the United States. In other words, we're not going backwards, we're going forward. This is America, we're the world's greatest country. This increase will be met by doubling electric power generation from renewable sources, which will account for 8% of that 25%, and natural gas, 17%. Electric power generation from coal and nuclear fuel will remain at current levels. In other words, we'll be using just as much coal in 2040 as we are now, and just as much nuclear in 2040 as we are now. But the increase of 25% will come from 1/3 from renewables and 2/3 from natural gas, according to this projection. The OECD's International Energy Agency projects in their International Energy Outlook for 2013 that world energy consumption will grow by 56% between 2010 and 2040. Much of the growth occurs in countries outside OECD, where demand is driven by strong long-term economic growth. Energy use in non-OECD countries increases by 90%. In OECD countries, it's 17%. Now, I'll be hastened to point out that the base in non-OECD countries is much less. So the developing countries are increasing just about as much in terms of absolute amounts as the non-OECD countries, just for the record. Both of these projections are based on the assumption that national policies and regulations stay the same. So there is a chance to change this if something happens in Paris. U.S. leadership will be a key part of any international agreement toward cutting greenhouse gas emissions. If we talk about all working together, but we're not ready to put anything in the pot, then guess what? We're the big dog, and if the big dog's leadership example is do nothing, then the rest of the dogs, never mind. I'm not saying that the nations of the world are dogs. Did I say that? Now, China And the US and India are the three largest emitters. So it isn't just developed countries. We have a couple of developing countries, arguably, in the top three. And China has overtaken the US as number one, US number two, India number three. US per capita emissions, however, are more than 3 times China's. So you're an American citizen, you use 3 times as much energy as China, and they are 12 times India's. So we're twice as much of an energy hog as the average Indian person. Therefore, U.S. policy related to climate change will be an important signal for other UN member states. And this previous information also points out that it isn't just developed countries that are in the game. We have a few emitters from developing countries who are in the top 10. 3 elements of U.S. policy are EPA's June 2014 Clean Power Plan, the Climate Action Plan that was put out in June 2013, and the Quadrennial Energy Review, Energy Transmission, Storage, and Distribution, which is expected later this fall. So you can argue that the United States is paying a lot of attention to this topic and doing a lot of reports. And I encourage you to pay attention to all of these balls, because they're all, I think, important. The U.S. EPA's Clean Power Plan would cut carbon emissions from the power sector by 30% nationwide below 2005 levels. And it would cut particle pollution, nitrogen oxides, and sulfur dioxide by more than 25% as a co-benefit, avoid up to 6,600 premature deaths and 150,000 asthma attacks in children, and up to 490,000 missed work or school days, providing up to $93 billion in climate and public health benefits. My job used to be to do these kind of stats, and there they are. And shrink electricity bills roughly 8% by increasing energy efficiency and reducing demand in the electricity system. EPA has received over 300,000 comments on this proposal and has taken 1,300 comments at 4 public meetings in the last couple of months. The plan is expected to be issued in June 2015. The states are then given flexibility in meeting requirements through plans which will be due in June 2016. So this will play out over the next 2 years. In preparation for proposing the Clean Power Plan, EPA met with the states of the U.S. and found that 47 have utilities that run demand-side energy efficiency programs, 38 have renewable portfolio standards, meaning you have to have a certain amount of renewables in your portfolio when you're providing electricity, and 10 have market-based greenhouse gas, where demand is driven by strong long-term economic growth. Energy use in non-OECD countries increases by 90%. In OECD countries, it's 17%. Now, let me hasten to point out that the base in non-OECD countries is much less. So the developing countries are increasing just about as much in terms of absolute amounts as the non-OECD countries, just for the record. Both of these projections are based on the assumption that national policies and regulations stay the same. So there is a chance to change this if something happens in Paris. U.S. leadership will be a key part of any international agreement toward cutting greenhouse gas emissions. If we talk about all working together, but we're not ready to put anything in the pot, then guess what? We're the big dog, and if the big dog's leadership example is do nothing, then the rest of the dogs, never mind. I'm not saying that the nations of the world are dogs. Did I say that? Now, China and the U.S. and India are the 3 largest emitters. So it isn't just developed countries. We have a couple of developing countries, arguably, in the top 3. And China has overtaken the U.S. as number 1, U.S. number 2, India number 3. U.S. per capita emissions, however, are more than 3 times China's. So you're an American citizen, you use 3 times as much energy as China, and they are 12 times India's. So we're twice as much of an energy hog as the average Indian person. Therefore, U.S. policy related to climate change will be an important signal for other UN member states. And previous information also points out that it isn't just developed countries that are in the game. We have a few emitters from developing countries who are in the top 10. Three elements of U.S. policy are EPA's June 2014 Clean Power Plan, the Climate Action Plan that was put out in June 2013, and the Quadrennial Energy Review, Energy Transmission, Storage, and Distribution, which is expected later this fall. So you can argue that the United States is paying a lot of attention to this topic and doing a lot of reports. And I encourage you to pay attention to all of these balls, because they're all, I think, important. The U.S. EPA's Clean Power Plan would cut carbon emissions from the power sector by 30% nationwide below 2005 levels. And it would cut particle pollution, nitrogen oxides, and sulfur dioxide by more than 25% as a co-benefit, avoid up to 6,600 premature deaths and 150,000 asthma attacks in children, and up to 490,000 missed work or school days, providing up to $93 billion in climate and public health benefits. My job used to be to do these kind of stats, and there they are. And shrink electricity bills roughly 8% by increasing energy efficiency and reducing demand in the electricity system. EPA has received over 300,000 comments on this proposal and has taken 1,300 comments at 4 public meetings in the last couple of months. The plan is expected to be issued in June 2015. The states are then given flexibility in meeting requirements through plans which will be due in June 2016. So this will play out over the next 2 years. In preparation for proposing the Clean Power Plan, EPA met with the states of the U.S. and found that 47 have utilities that run demand-side energy efficiency programs. 38 have renewable portfolio standards, meaning you have to have a certain amount of renewables in your portfolio when you're providing electricity, and 10 have market-based greenhouse gas emissions programs. So EPA did its homework, found out that there's a lot going on, and they've taken a lot of comments. They're not just shooting from the hip, and they're not just crazy. You consider the source. I did work there for 34 years. But never mind, I don't think they are. I think they're doing a really sincere effort. The Climate Action Plan, which came out in 2013, says we're going to cut carbon pollution, and of course this clean energy plan is a big piece of that. Prepare the U.S. for impacts of climate change. And the fellow from Peru talked about impacts of climate change on the forest in Peru and how that's a really important agenda issue for them. Well, in the U.S., we're making it one of our top 3 also. And lead international efforts to combat global climate change and prepare for its impacts. Okay, and there's an announcement this week that we're deciding to go around the Senate, where 67 votes proves to be hard, even for a treaty such as the rights of the child, which we haven't taken action on. Maybe this is a smart way to go, and maybe naming and shaming is going to be important. This plan emphasizes efficiency gains, which lower energy demand, increase mileage standards, which will lower energy consumption in transportation, and substitutes natural gas for coal to lower emissions from electricity generation. And I say that last one is important to me because it acknowledges that natural gas, which has about half the carbon impact as coal, may be an intermediate step. And I understand that in these halls that all fossil fuels are bad guys, but in the short term, we need to pay attention to what is going to be marginal improvements, in my humble opinion. You've probably noticed by now how humble my opinions are. And I want to talk about the Quadrennial Energy Review, which will provide a multi-year roadmap that outlines federal energy policy objectives, legislative proposals to Congress, executive actions, and research development programs and funding and financing and incentive programs. The first installment, which will come out later this fall, will focus on transmission, storage, and distribution infrastructure that links energy supplies to intermediate and end users. And that's real important because where the wind is not where the people are that use electricity. And where the solar is isn't necessarily where it is. So if we don't invest in this infrastructure to transmit the electricity from where it can be generated to where it's needed, we're whistling Dixie. Oh, imagine that. I'm not from the South. I'm from New England. The U.S. House of Representatives has passed budget legislation which forbids EPA to proceed with the Clean Power Plan. A lawsuit by 12 states, they're the coal states by the way, seeks to stop the Clean Power Plan. And both the House budget legislation and the state's lawsuit also call for an end to EPA's rulemaking on carbon as a pollutant, which was issued in 2013, on which I believe the U.S. EPA has received 3 million comments. Figure out how you're going to answer those comments, every one of them. Okay, the Clean Power Plan is a key element of U.S. participation in the global effort to lower greenhouse gas emissions, without which ominous projections will prevail. In other words, all these projections are made based on the current state of affairs. The Clean Power Plan is a new element of the game. If the U.S. pursues the Clean Power Plan, it will cut emissions by 30%. If it doesn't, they'll stay about the same, no cut, and probably go up. By the way, I look at it, because you can't get 25% more electricity out of nothing. Something's got to happen. Just my opinion. However, as a veteran of the wars of garbage, which is where I was for 34 years, I want to say that there are other ways for the global community to go. We didn't have regulations to stop the 30,000 open dumps in America, which are now down to maybe 500. We use persuasion, and you use persuasion by enrolling people. For example, the cities of America currently have lots and lots of opportunity to save energy with various projects through efficiency. If the U.S. government had a program of highlighting those that are doing the right thing, had a couple of experts who were looking into better ways to do the right thing, and had lists of how much is coming out of cities that are doing the wrong thing, mind you, that's most all the cities, so then we would have a game where people would be aware of their opportunities for making change in the right directions. And what you do to put a little charge on that is you have grants to the various organizations where cities work, the National Association of Counties, the International City Managers, Public Works Association, and the national legislative bodies. There are state legislatures also have their national organizations, and you give them a grant to have workshops at every one of their annual meetings about what you can do to save energy in your town or your state. And that kind of thing might also apply to the international level. When I was back at EPA, I met the person from the U.S. government who was our representative to the United Nations Environmental Program. Was he an engineer who was helping them come up with better ideas? No. Was he a scientist helping them invent better things? No. He was a lawyer, and his job was to make sure that nothing happened that was going to increase the scope of work of UNEP, which was to be following the language of about 5,000 treaties. Let's see now, let's polish up the language, but let's not do anything. Well, I think we've gone beyond that at UNEP, and I think UNEP would be a great place to have a little bit of afterburner on our efforts to combat climate change.
Now, there have been a lot of people who've come in who don't necessarily know the initial speakers, so I want very quickly to tell you that our first one here is Tapio Kaninen, and he is currently the Senior Fellow and Co-Director of the Project on Sustainable Global Governance at the Ralph Bunche Institute for International Studies at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. And George, I think you know by now, has been working in the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. And so now we move on to Amy Perek-Mehta, who is a program management officer at the International Union for Conservation of Nature. And she will speak about climate change and energy issues seen in the Sustainable Development Goals. Amy.
Thank you very much. First, I want to thank Tapio and George for setting up very nicely what I'm about to speak about. I know Tapia made a reference to the Sustainable Development Goals. I want to start off by actually distributing to all of you a copy of the actual 17 goals that were decided in July by the Open Working Group on Sustainable Development Goals. So if you'll please pass this around, I'd appreciate it. And if you can just, sorry, if you can leave one present. Thank you so much. And then I'm also going to, yes.
One. There we go.
In addition to the actual goals, there were also specific targets that were decided upon or suggested by the Urban Working Group, specifically on energy and climate change. So I'm also going to have you take one and pass this along. I'll save some for our co-panelists. You can take one and pass it along. So what I'd like to do is start off with a little bit of history. I'm going to just provide an overview to all of you of what I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to start off by providing a little bit of history. I'll provide a little bit of history of the process of the Open Working Group on Sustainable Development Goals. I'll get into a little bit as to the reasons as to why energy and climate change issues are important, but I think Tapia and George both did a great job of covering that for me. I'm also going to provide a little bit of discussion about what led to these specific goals on energy and climate change. I'll provide some examples of some of the positions of various member states of countries while they were negotiating during the meetings of the Open Working Group on Sustainable Development Goals. We'll look at the actual goals and targets that are being distributed as I speak. And we'll also discuss some of the indicators that have been suggested for energy and climate change issues. Finally, an organization known as the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, in addition to making suggestions about specific goals and targets, have also created a paper kind of suggesting how this will be applied at the national level, how all the work taking place at the UN in establishing sustainable development goals will actually be translated at the country level. So I'll give an example of one of the countries they looked at, which was Australia. So I wanted to start out by kind of talking about the history of the Sustainable Development Goal process. During the UN Conference on Sustainable Development at Rio+20, which took place in 2012, member states agreed to launch a process to develop a set of sustainable development goals and call for an open working group on sustainable development goals. The outcome document of the Rio+20 conference outlines specifically the importance of remaining firmly committed to the full and timely achievement of the Millennium Development Goals. They specify that the Sustainable Development Goals should be action-oriented, concise, easy to communicate, limited in number, aspirational, global in nature, universally applicable to all countries, and focused on priority areas for the achievement of sustainable development. Those are important characteristics because these specific terms were repeated over and over again during the negotiations of the Open Working Group on Sustainable Development Goals. They also talked about, in the outcome document Rio+20, the need to ensure coordination and coherence with the processes considering the post-2015 development agenda. Finally, they talked about the importance of assessing progress toward the achievement of goals and the importance of global integrated and scientifically based information on sustainable development and of supporting regional economic commissions in collecting and compiling national inputs to inform this global effort. So just a little bit of background on this process. We talk about it a lot, but we don't always understand kind of what the basis is for this process. Now, specifically, and we did talk a little bit about, co-panelists talk a little bit about some statistics. With regard to energy, some 1.4 billion people have no access to electricity, and 1 billion more only have access to unreliable electricity networks. This is basically, I'm talking about these statistics to give you an idea about why these issues are important and why it's important to develop goals on these topics. The benefits of achieving universal access to modern energy services are transformational. They can be applied towards lighting for schools, functional health clinics, pumps for water and sanitation, cleaner indoor air, faster food processing, and more income-generating opportunities. Energy is central to sustainable development. It accelerates social and economic progress and enhances productivity. No country is developed without access to reliable and affordable energy. Also, without access to sustainable energy services, other development goals cannot be achieved. Energy impacts on people, communities, countries, in terms of everything from economic growth, employment, health, security, and education. Now, why a goal on climate change? And as you saw, I distributed the full comprehensive list of goals, but we're focusing specifically on energy and climate change. So, why climate change? The Climate Action Network stated that climate change threatens the existence of human society as we know it, and therefore the Sustainable Development Goals must tackle it to have integrity. The impacts of climate change will hinder global efforts to eradicate poverty. Climate change represents one of the biggest threats to food security. Specific attention to climate change and disasters and Sustainable Development Goals will ensure coherence between climate negotiations and act as a successor to the Hyogo framework for action. The other important reason to incorporate this into the Sustainable Development Goals is that they weren't specifically addressed in the Millennium Development Goals, which are expiring in 2015. And it was important for the Sustainable Development Goals to carry forward the work that was started by the Millennium Development Goals and improve it and enhance it. Specifically with regard to energy, the UN's Sustainable Energy for All initiative was launched in September 2011 with the aim of achieving 3 main objectives by 2030. One was ensuring universal access to modern energy services. 2 was doubling the share of renewable energy in the global energy mix. And 3 was doubling the global rate of improvement in energy efficiency. Now, if you look at the sheet that I distributed with the actual targets under the goal on energy, you will see that those 3 targets that are under that goal were the same ones that were identified by the UN Sustainable Energy for All initiative. So the Open Working Group takes very seriously into consideration ongoing processes at the UN. With respect to climate change, there was some controversy related to the climate change goal. There was a question as to whether or not there should be a climate change goal at all. Some thought that the issue of climate change should be mainstreamed across the Sustainable Development Goals with targets in relevant goals on energy, food, water, and so on. Others thought there should be a standalone goal on climate change. However, the reason that this was controversial was because there are already processes in place which were mentioned by my co-panelists, such as the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and those that were negotiating the goals were not sure how a specific goal would conflict with the actual processes that are going on. The difference between the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Sustainable Development Goals is that the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is a legal instrument, while the Sustainable Development Goals are aspirational targets that align everybody to common goals. Therefore, in the latest version that was distributed of the goals, the actual final recommendations from the Open Working Group, climate change was in fact included, and the targets that you see on the sheets that I've distributed were in fact there. Please take note of the fact that under the statement for Goal 13, which is take urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts, there was actually an asterisk acknowledging that the UNFCCC is the primary international intergovernmental forum for negotiating the global response to climate change. And this is what addressed that very issue that they were discussing, and that was controversial about that specific goal. I'm going to go into a little bit of the history of the Open Working Group itself and kind of, how they went about their work, how they chose to address these issues. In the beginning, there were some suggestions. There were some areas that were suggested as a result of the meetings that took place at Rio Plus 20. They took this list of topics and suggestions, and they met for the first time in March of 2013. They hadn't yet formulated exactly what their areas of focus would be, but they kind of came up with some preliminary thoughts as to how they would address these issues. So I'll just give you a few examples. Serbia addressed the issue of resource efficiency. Zimbabwe and Zambia mentioned the importance of climate change. Sri Lanka also listed climate change as one of its top priorities. There were other meetings that took place basically in the coming months, in the subsequent months of 2013, which really focused on particular areas. So there were clusters that were discussed. So basically what happened was the Open Working Group determined a list of issues that they would discuss issue by issue, and they called in experts in those particular fields. It was the first process that I had seen at the UN where there weren't delegates reading prepared statements, but they were actually challenged to listen to the panelists and actually give their reactions on the spot. So it was a very much, it was called stock taking. That's the name they had given to the first year of the process of the Open Working Group. And that took place from March 2013 all the way up to March of 2014, where they would go, they would receive papers in advance, and they would go with the intent of learning and engaging with the speakers and engaging with each other. From this process, they were able to then, in March 2014, come up with a list of specific focus areas that were addressed, and which also included energy and climate change. This list of focus areas consisted of a list of 19 areas, and energy and climate change were definitely high priorities on the list, and there was an emphasis on retaining them as standalone goals. In the interest of time, I'm not getting into as much detail. However, there was, that same kind of conflict that I described, whether or not climate change should be treated as an independent goal, was discussed in these subsequent meetings, and it was eventually decided that it was too important to not include in the final list of Sustainable Development Goals. The final version of the goals, which you have with you, was decided upon in July of this year. The list also contains a goal on peaceful societies, which was also one of the most contentious goals that were in this list. And, going to the actual goals themselves, they focus on three particular, if we look at climate change specifically, they focus on three particular areas. Strengthen 13.1, goal 13 is take urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts. 13.1, strengthen resilience and adaptive capacity to climate-related hazards and disasters in all countries. 13.2, integrate climate change measures into national policies, strategies, and planning. 13.3, improve education, awareness raising, and human and institutional capacity on climate change mitigation, impact reduction, and early warning. These are specific targets, and these targets are what I would say is the substance of the Sustainable Development Goals. In the interest of time, I'm just going to let you read about the goal of energy and the specific targets that are there. But very quickly, I just wanted to let you all know that the Sustainable Development Solutions Network has made a recommendation that countries themselves should come up with their own specific goals, targets, and indicators that mirror, that match in some ways what the goals are that have been suggested by the Open Working Group on Sustainable Development Goals. And specifically, they made an example of, they produced a report specifically addressing Australia, and they came up with a goal, target, and some limited targets. The goal for Australia would be ensure sustainable energy and curb human-induced climate change. And the targets specifically talk about reducing emissions and increasing the share of renewable energy. What my recommendation is that all countries should use this report as an example and really take it now to the national level, take all of this work and really figure out how this is going to be applied, not only nationally but locally, to really turn all of this talk, to really turn all of these discussions into concrete action. Thank you very much for your time.
We've heard three very different presentations so far. One who says that going to hell in a handbasket. Another one who says that within our own country of the U.S., it's very difficult to make any kind of progress. A third who has given a global workshop, global projections of what ought to be done by countries as they work to improve the future. Now we have Vadim Belikov, who will also put in a punch. And in his case, and because of the many people who've arrived, after we began, I'm going to identify that Vadim comes from the business sector in St. Petersburg, Russia, and he has a number of non-profit relationships having to do with energy and business and new perspectives. Oh. And thank you very much. So energy, business, new perspectives, and coming from St. Petersburg, Russia. So he's got a different outlook on life than one might find normally in New York. So I invite him to talk about social entrepreneurs for solutions in energy and climate action. Thank you so much.
Thank you, David. Now I'm on you to have
Louder.
Can't hear.
You cannot hear.
Yep.
You need the microphone closer.
Good. Now I'm more New Yorker than Russian. Yes.
But an international perspective.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Thank you to my colleagues for so emotional discussion. A lot of energy and a lot of emotion. I would like to explain how social entrepreneurs can be involved in solution in energy and climate action. At the beginning, we can identify who is the social and social entrepreneurs and social innovators. What is the difference between common business and social business? Common business focused only on the profit, but social entrepreneurs focus on the new social ideas, new social value, and sustainable development based on the social sustainable. Of course, social innovators and entrepreneurs can compare with world energy lobby, but they improve this situation step by step, and now we have 2% of clean energy in all energy system. In 2011 we held G8 and G20 youth summits in Paris, and I was disappointed when head of Total explained young generation that 2011 we held G8 and G20 Youth Summit in Paris, and I was disappointed when head of Total explained to young generation that next 30 years they will buy coal, oil and gas, and forget about clean energy. But you know that social entrepreneurs never give up, and they focus on the three columns. It's clean energy and green energy based on solar, wind and biofuel, and second is smart city, and the third is climate change. Yesterday I met very interesting Indian girls who's head of solar system company, and she explained us how the social entrepreneurs can be involved in global energy solution. Now social energy solutions stay close to education, and social entrepreneurs educate people on the ground how to use clean energy in new solutions. And for example, it's a little bit difficult to transfer oil and gas at the center of India or Africa. And they use the small solar panels just to charge the phone and to cook food, the simple food. Maybe it's not a big deal, but it's a big step to change the climate problem, because now you can fly to Dominican Republic and you will see the difference between Haiti and Dominican Republic. You can see clean the border between two close countries, because people from Haiti use wood to prepare their food, and now they move to Dominican Republic and use the same wood coal. It's a terrible situation, because the Haitian part is great when you fly, but you will see the green and successful Dominican Republic. And now social entrepreneurs from Dominican Republic educate people from Haiti about new technologies and how to use the new possibilities, how to use gas, and gas is better than wood, and so on and so on. The social entrepreneurs movement started in 1960s, but now we have thousands of social entrepreneurs, and we hear their voice louder and louder, especially young generation. We have a lot of problem where the voice of young generation involved in world decision of the global problems. I would like to show you the second example. I was really surprised when I met a young German guy started his program Plan for the Planet. He was just 9 years old, simple guy, and he created this movement in Germany. Now this movement crossed the border of 93 countries, and from 2009 they planted millions and millions of trees around the world. It's amazing. Young guy, now he's 14 years, but he's ambassador of in the climate change program. It's amazing. It's two very short examples, but it can show us how the new generation and how the social entrepreneurs can be involved in solution. Unfortunately, we have not enough time, and to give you more
right to the people in the seats ahead of me to ask questions of one or another or all of the speakers of the panel. Yes.
I have a comment to make. If would you kindly leave a business card, and so we know who you are, or we can have you write your names down on a piece of paper and how to contact you. I'd love to be in touch after this meeting if you are in agreement. Thank you. And there are brochures in the back of the United Nations Association that you may have, and we would welcome your participation. Thank you.
Yes.
I had a question for Mr. Garland when you were talking about the natural gas and going through with that movement. I also believe that's true, but I have real concern about the fracking that's happening and there, and with all of the hazardous waste and all the way. Can you speak anything to that?
I sure can. America is a little bit of a cowboy republic. And when people want to do things, we generally let them do them. And then we pick up the pieces afterwards and count the damage cases, and then there are regulations. So fracking is taken off totally, virtually in the absence of regulation. And just as background, in my Lurie Pass, implementing the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, the Bevel Amendment forbade EPA from regulating utilities, mining, like that. So it's what shall I say, an unusual thing when EPA can regulate something like fracking. My take is that fracking needs to be regulated. I have a good friend who works in this area at EPA, and he explained that the energy companies want the drilling to happen very quickly, and that means there are holes in the cement that's supposed to be not having holes in it. There are pinholes, but things are under a great deal of pressure, so things come out. In addition, the liquids that come out are just disposed of in bad ways many times, and that's another area where regulation might have an impact. Another area is what's in the drilling fluids, and there was a little cartoon recently about someone bringing a bunch of bad stuff. It's right now a trade secret, so EPA can't ask that question. Regulatory agencies can't ask that question, what's in it? And that needs to be changed. You can't have trade secrets where we get to know what's in there, but not how much. And how much is real important when things are coming out of pinholes under great pressure. So from my perspective, regulation is the answer, not banning. However, go get them. Good luck. But I think you're going to be lucky if you can even regulate the suckers, let alone ban them, because we are the cowboy republic. Yes?
Hi, I have two areas of interest. The fracking, we know, has poisoned at least 10 wells for farmers upstate. We know that. We have that documented. You probably know that too. So I think banning it is a great idea. However, the biggest problem is having all this stuff travel through New York City in trucks, and the water, what do you call it? Watershed nearby. If there's anything wrong with that, that's going to kill us all. Golly. The second thing, so we'll all have to work very hard to get fracking out of the way, for heaven's sakes, these people are poisoning us, or will. The second thing is I want to talk about was air cars. Now they're using air cars in India. They're made in France. They're using them in India. They're using them in Australia. And they are not fast cars, but they are very efficient. All they do is put air in them. That's that. We can have air stations and stop the blessed oil that is really polluting our planet. I'm not very expressive, but I hope you understand what I'm saying. Yeah. And I hope someone will comment.
So within the general framework of climate topics like fracking and like air cars, this is the first I've heard of those, are elements that may possibly lead towards a better future if they are managed well. I'd like to hear some other questions. Yes?
I'm just curious what the asterisk means under Goal 13, acknowledging that the UNFCCC is the primary international intergovernmental forum for negotiating global response to climate change.
Yeah, it's just basically showing respect to the current processes that are already in place and just making sure that everyone knows that the Sustainable Development Goals are not superseding the processes that are already occurring with the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change.
So is it conflictual or not really?
It's basically giving precedent to the UNFCCC over the Sustainable Development Goals.
Tapio.
Yeah, maybe I just comment on this because based on my some 30 years experience at the UN, that UN bodies are very jealous about their turfs, and there has been a very heated debate on whether, like, Security Council, who can give binding decisions, should be involved in climate change negotiations, because the climate change is really affecting ultimately the generation of conflicts in the world, and that is increasing trends all over the world. And so far, like, Security Council has been able to debate climate change already a number of times, but there's a great unwillingness by some countries to get the Security Council involved. And so in every other body, there is this same turf mentality, and I think that's a really unfortunate thing, because everything these days is so much interconnected. We have to have holistic solutions and not going into the silos as the UN has a tendency to do.
Yes?
Why do you think we were able to act on chlorofluorocarbons in the 1970s globally, and now, albeit a more complex problem, are paralyzed on the CO2 in the atmosphere?
I think industry, DuPont, was engaged in coming up with substitutes. So it was relatively, what shall I say, cooperation with business to just find a substitute so we didn't have to use that anymore. And so that went fairly smoothly because it was, what shall I say, a practical thing to do.
Yes.
Thank you. First of all, thank you very much to the panel for providing such a diverse opinion, views, and expertise. But I wanted to go back to Tapio Kaninen's point about a global cap and trade policy in the future. In the past, looking back on policies like the Kyoto Protocol versus something like the Clean Air Act in the United States, how could we and the governments make efforts for a more efficient and well-controlled and monitored policy? Because I know that with something like the Kyoto Protocol, it was hard to monitor, but then something like the United States' Clean Air Act, it was easy to monitor based on the technologies, and maybe it was because it was such smaller region. So what are the better approaches that we would be having to focus on in the future for a global cap and trade policy?
Yeah, I guess this is a key issue. There has been a number of cap and trade systems, and I guess there are both positive examples and negative ones. And actually, how acid rain was controlled is a kind of cap and trade system, which was a successful one, and that was successful, I guess, because it was relatively simple and issue, and controlling cap it's a little bit more appealing to a number of politically conservative persons, because we are not talking about tax, as the other alternatives are really carbon tax, and this is just a kind of market mechanism. It's based on private market principles, so it should appeal to Republicans also in the United States, but it's not that easy. So there are innovative ideas about this, and I guess the basic issue, and I'm also working on this, that we should get in the Paris Agreement some kind of opening to this, so that it would start really directing the investment from fossil fuels to renewables. So that's the key.
John, I think you had a question.
Yeah, I was wondering about the this handout about the goal 7 and goal 13. I was looking down, all of these, through the lens of what I heard were sort of basic ideas of how you set a goal. And one of them was that something be specific and measurable, and then it be something not just aspirational, but also something that would tend to generate progress toward solving it. And so when I look at the energy one, the only one I see that's really measurable is 7.3, double the global rate. Everything else is increased substantially, enhance, expand, and so then I look at what's the date on these things, and if you have something like increase substantially by 2030, by 2030 enhance, by 2030 expand, what it looks like is somebody who wanted to either kill this thing or slow it down to the max, or negotiated this wording so that they'd be able to say, well, we can forget about that until about 2025 or 2028 or something like that. Is that what happened? And the same thing, I guess, reflects the difficulty of negotiating with climate change. There's only one that really has anything specific in it, which is the $100 billion annually by 2020. Everything else is strengthening, integrating to promote, and there aren't even any dates in there on that one. And so is that an accurate sort of speculation as to what happened in the process, or was something else going on? The energy one, I think, is particularly bothersome because it would be so easy to have every one of those things do something that would promote much more action much more quickly. And so I'm just wondering, was that the process by which this happened?
Amy?
Thank you for your question. You're giving me an opportunity to address something that I didn't have the time for in my talk, which was the fact that in addition to these goals and targets, they are also working towards having specific indicators under the targets, which will have even greater detail as far as time frame, as far as guidelines, as far as specifics. And with these indicators, for example, under energy, so I'm reading the indicators that were suggested by the Sustainable Development Solutions Network. They talk about looking at the share of the population. For example, they're looking at these specific indicators to then look at whether these goals and targets are being addressed. So the specific indicators for energy are share of the population with access to modern cooking solutions, share of the population with access to reliable electricity, implicit incentives for low carbon energy in the electricity sector, rate of primary energy intensity improvement. And what they'll do is then come up with accountability mechanisms to then look at these indicators over a certain period of time, whether it's annually or every few years, to see if we're actually working on getting these goals met. But I think in terms of the 2030 and the time frame, what they didn't want to do, and there was a lot of back and forth, there was discussion in these meetings saying, hey, what are we doing here? Are we giving ourselves way too much time, and are we going to completely postpone having any action on this? But I think what they were worried about was that if they had something that was potentially a date that was too close in the near future, that there would be no chance of completing it. So they wanted to give themselves enough time, but then through the targets and through the indicator and through these accountability mechanisms, they would follow up. Some of the indicators really quickly for climate change are looking at the availability and implementation of a transparent and detailed decarbonization strategy, looking at the intensity of the power sector and of new power generation, looking at the transport sector. So these are examples of kind of, they're looking at measuring net greenhouse gas emissions in agriculture, forest, and other land use sectors. So those are the kinds of things that they're going to be looking at in greater detail. These are, again, suggestions. The indicators have yet to be set, but these are some of the suggestions that have been come up with.
I'd like to say that if you wait until 2030 to report on the progress, then shame on you. And if there's no budget for anybody to do any reporting next year and the year after that on all these things, then shame on us.
It's time to wrap up. It's 1 o'clock. I would like to make one comment that fits with this recent exchange, and that is that in relation to the Millennium Development Goals, it was the same story of getting the goals and then targets and then indicators. And in fact, the Millennium Development Goals were not an immediate result of the Millennium Declaration in 2000. It took a couple of years more for that all to be worked out. And so that, there was a lot of opposition. The U.S. government was very much opposed to the Millennium Development Goals. I saw that at close hand. So it's something that has to develop and be worked on. Similarly with the human development indicators that the UN Development Program came up with. At first, everybody hated it. Now, everybody loves it. And it's even become passé. So let's hope that we can become just so ordinary in the work on climate and energy. I would just love to see it because it doesn't look like that at the moment. Now it's 1 o'clock, so officially this session is ended. Anyone who would like to continue on an informal basis, have a little chat, is certainly welcome to do so. I think that some of us on the panel will be here for a few minutes at least, and I want to thank you all very, very much for participating.
But you're certainly welcome.
Another guy who's making trips on us.
National acts in this country are very hard to get. And just by mentioning
So they're all going back to where you're going to do an interview.